looming shadows of Victorian asylums, 20 lives were swallowed whole. These were not just patients, they were a haunting mix of monsters and misfits. Some were genuine murderers, their hands still stained with blood, locked away where society could forget their crimes. Others were ordinary souls, imprisoned for nothing more than a broken heart, a sharp tongue, or the simple misfortune of being poor and female in an unforgiving age. Between cold baths, leather restraints, and the endless silence of stone corridors, the line between madness and malice blurred beyond recognition. Their stories, some deserved, some stolen, still echo through those forgotten halls, begging to be heard. Richard Dadd was confined for a shocking and violent murder. In 1843, after a trip to the Middle East and the onset of severe delusions, he stabbed his father to death in Cobham Park, believing he was acting under supernatural command. He fled to France, attacked another man on the way, and was returned to England. In 1844, he was committed to the criminal wing of Bethlehem, then moved to Broadmoor when it opened. He spent the rest of his life in confinement, still producing intricate paintings, such as the Fairy Feller's Masterstroke, and died at Broadmoor in 1886 of tuberculosis. William Chester Minor was confined after killing an innocent man in London in 1872. Suffering from intense paranoid delusions, he believed someone had broken into his room and shot George Merritt dead. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent to Broadmoor. There he lived under supervision, but was allowed books, which led to his extraordinary work for the Oxford English Dictionary. His mental illness later worsened and included severe self-harm. In 1910, he was deported to the United States, where he spent his remaining years in psychiatric care, and died in 1920. Daniel Naughton was confined after a politically motivated killing in 1843. Convinced that he was being persecuted by the government, he tried to shoot Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, but instead shot Peel's private secretary, Edward Bennett, who later died. Naughton was found not guilty on grounds of insanity and committed to Bethlehem, later becoming the case that gave English law the Naughton rules on criminal insanity. He remained in custody for the rest of his life and died in 1865. Edward Oxford was confined after attempting to assassinate Queen Victoria in 1840. At 17, he fired 2 pistols at the Queen's carriage as she rode with Prince Albert. Though neither shot hit its target, he was found insane and sent to Bethlehem, later to Broadmoor. Unlike many criminal patients, he improved over time, learned useful trades, and was eventually conditionally released on the understanding that he would leave Britain. He emigrated to Australia under a new name and died there in 1900. Louis Wain was not confined for a violent crime, but because of severe mental illness. Famous for his anthropomorphic cat drawings, he was certified insane in 1924 and admitted to Springfield Mental Hospital, later moving to Bethlehem and then Habsbury. His confinement was long-term custodial care rather than punishment, though he continued painting throughout it. His later art became more abstract and intense, and his case is now often discussed in connection with schizophrenia, though historians still debate the diagnosis. Louis Wain remained in institutional care until his death in 1939. John Clare was confined because of severe mental breakdown rather than a criminal act. In 1837, he entered High Beach Asylum after delusions and emotional collapse, escaped in 1841, and was later admitted to Northampton General Lunatic Asylum, where he spent the rest of his life. His treatment was the typical institutional care of the period: supervision, routine, and confinement, rather than any modern therapy. Even so, he kept writing, producing some of his most haunting later poetry, including I Am. John Clare died in the Northampton Asylum in 1864, reportedly after a stroke. Christiana Edmonds was confined after a series of poisonings that caused at least 1 death. Obsessed with a doctor in Brighton, she laced chocolate creams with strychnine, intending to harm his wife, but a young boy died after eating one of the poison sweets. In 1872, she was convicted, sentenced to death, and then reprieved because of insanity. She was sent to Broadmoor, where she remained for the rest of her life. Her confinement was permanent, and she died there in 1907. Roderick MacLean was confined after trying to shoot Queen Victoria in 1882. As the Queen left Windsor Station, he fired a revolver at her and missed. He was tried for high treason and found not guilty, but insane, a verdict that reportedly angered Victoria and helped lead to the Trial of Lunatics Act 1883. MacLean was sent to Broadmoor, where he stayed for the rest of his life. He continued writing poetry in confinement, but never regained freedom, and he died at Broadmoor in 1921. Harriet Jordan appears in the record, not as a criminal patient, but as a Bethlehem patient diagnosed with acute mania in 1858. Museum of the Mine Material identifies her as a 24-year-old cloak and mantle maker. One hospital account says that during her illness she became agitated, tore her clothes, and was generally destructive. Later photographs show her calmer and sewing. I have not found a reliable published record of a violent crime, release date, or death date for her. In other words, the surviving public record shows severe mental distress and Bethlehem confinement, but not a clearly documented criminal act. Captain George Johnston is one of the harder cases, because the public record online is thin. The surviving summaries consistently say he was admitted to Bethlehem in 1846 with mania and had been charged with homicide, but I have not been able to verify from a reliable published source the specific killing detail. What can be said with confidence is that he was treated as a criminal lunatic patient at Bethlehem after a homicide charge, and that his portrait survives in later museum and press summaries. I have not found a reliable public record of his release or death. Esther Hannah still was confined for illness rather than a known criminal offense. The surviving Bethlehem image captions identify her as a patient admitted in 1858 with chronic mania and delusions. She became one of the photographed faces of Victorian asylum medicine, but the public record says almost nothing about the life that brought her there. I have not found a reliable published account of a violent crime, nor a clearly documented release or death record. So for Esther, the honest version is this: she was confined because of serious mental illness, carefully observed and photographed, but much of her personal story has been lost. Eliza Camplin was confined not for a documented violent crime, but after being diagnosed with acute mania and admitted to Bethlehem in 1857. Public archive references identify her by name and diagnosis, and 2 portraits of her survive. Beyond that, very little is firmly documented in accessible sources. There is no clear public record of a trial, major offense, release, or death. So the safest documentary wording is that Eliza Camplin was one of the many Victorian women whose identity in the records became reduced almost entirely to a diagnosis and a photograph, rather than a full life story. William Norris was confined after being judged violently insane, apparently following a head injury. He became infamous not because of one famous murder, but because of the appalling restraint regime used on him in Bethlehem. Around 1814, he was chained in an iron harness and fixed to the wall for years, an image that later became a symbol of asylum cruelty and reform. His case helped expose the brutal treatment of psychiatric patients in the period. He was eventually released from those restraints, but the later details of his life and death remain unclear in the public record. Margaret Hunter, also known as Margaret Beaton, was confined after killing her infant son during a severe mental collapse. In April 1867, after bereavement, repeated childbirth, and a return of earlier mental illness, she cut the throat of her baby Alexander, who was just over 3 months old. She was too insane to plead, and was admitted that year to Perth Criminal Lunatic Department. Her case notes over the years describe her as at times delusional, obscene, excited, and violent. At one point, she was locked in a padded room and given purgatives. She was later conditionally released and recalled more than once, and after decades in confinement was eventually moved to district asylums. Mary Ann Mello was confined after a violent knife attack on her housekeeper. The available free online summaries say that, while pregnant and in the grip of drink-fueled mental instability, she tried to cut the woman's throat and was sent to Broadmoor as insane. Those same summaries say she gave birth while confined and was later released after several years. I need to be careful here. Unlike some of the better-known cases, freely accessible high-quality sources are limited. So I would treat details beyond the basic attack, Broadmoor confinement, childbirth, and later release as less certain, unless checked in trial records or archive files. Francis Breton was confined after being charged with murdering his daughter. Wakefield records summarized online say that in 1848 he was found insane after being indicted for the willful murder of his daughter Maria. Allegedly beaten to death with a poker, he was first sent to Wakefield Asylum, where he was considered dangerous and escape-prone, then to Bethlehem, and later to Broadmoor in 1865. There, after a serious fall and bleeding injury, he underwent treatment under chloroform. His heart stopped during the procedure, and he died, with the subsequent inquest clearing the staff. Anne Laycock was confined after a serious attempted assault that the records describe as cutting and wounding with intent to murder. In 1850, she was admitted to Wakefield from Sheffield Workhouse during what was said to be her first attack of mania. Asylum records report that she had to be restrained and washed for self-harm because she beat her head against the wall in bed. Once she improved somewhat, she was sent back to York Castle Gaol to face the earlier charge of attacking the pregnant wife of a man with whom Anne had had an illegitimate child. The jury found her insane, but her later fate is unclear. Peter Douglas was confined not for a famous murder, but after being convicted as a rogue and vagabond, and removed from prison to Wakefield Asylum in 1863. The records summarized online describe him as a hawker in a weak physical state, believed to be suffering from dementia, but also as cunning and suspicious. His case became notable because he escaped from the asylum and was never recaptured, an unusual and embarrassing failure for the authorities. So in Peter Douglas' case, the reason for confinement was petty criminality mixed with suspected insanity. And his story ends not in a recorded asylum death, but in disappearance. Eliza Jocelyn was confined for acute melancholia, what we would now call severe depressive illness, not for a violent crime. Bethlehem archive listings show her admitted in 1856 and again in 1857, and photographed both while ill and later in convalescence. Her case is often cited because those paired photographs seem to show visible change over time. Beyond that, the public record is sparse. I have not found a documented criminal act, nor a reliable published record of how or when she died. So for Eliza Jocelyn, the key fact is that she was an asylum patient whose illness, rather than a crime, brought her into Bethlehem's records. Fanny Barrett was confined as a Bethlehem patient with intermittent mania, not for a clearly documented violent offense in the public sources I found. The surviving captions and later reproductions consistently identify her as admitted in 1858 with that diagnosis, but they provide almost no further biographical detail. There is no accessible, reliable record I found of a release, transfer, or death date, and no confirmed criminal act attached to her case in the public summaries. So the honest documentary version is that Fanny Barrett represents one of the many Victorian women remembered mainly through a diagnosis and a photograph, not a full surviving life history. They were called mad, they were called lost, and some were something far more dangerous. Among them were the broken, the misunderstood, and yes, the violent, the unpredictable, even the monstrous. People who had crossed lines that could never be undone. But the walls did not distinguish. They closed just the same around the innocent and the guilty, the fragile and the fearsome, the victim and the villain. Inside those corridors, humanity did not disappear. It fractured, because even in the darkest minds, there were moments of clarity, of regret, of something painfully human. And even among the most gentle, there were those who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, in a world that did not understand them. We want to divide them cleanly, to say these were the monsters, and these were the victims. But the truth is far more unsettling. They were all human. And if we look too quickly, too comfortably from a distance, we risk forgetting that the same fear, the same judgment, the same need to lock away what we do not understand, still lives with us today. Thanks for watching.